Looking back now, I realize my whole life had been building toward that moment when Max and I first laid eyes on the old Henderson barn. 73 years of small-town living, of calloused hands and honest work, had taught me to spot value where others saw only decay. But nothing, not decades of restoring engines, not raising 3 children, not even burying my Sarah 5 years back, had prepared me for what we'd uncover beneath those rotting boards. I suppose it started with my grandfather's stories about the Depression, how his family survived by fixing what others threw away. He'd take me to his workshop behind the house, old-stained concrete floor and pegboard walls lined with tools that had seen better decades, teaching me that everything broken could find new purpose if you had patience and the right touch. The smell of motor oil and WD-40 became my childhood comfort, mixing with sawdust and the metallic tang of honest sweat. He'd say, "Bobby, most folks see problems where we see possibilities." His rough fingers would guide mine over carburetor parts, showing me how patience and persistence could bring dead engines back to life. Those lessons sank deeper than I knew, shaping how I'd approach every challenge that followed. My father carried forward that same philosophy when he took over the family auto repair shop downtown. By 16, I was spending summers there, learning that reputation meant more than profit, that treating people fairly would sustain you longer than any quick scheme. The shop became our family's anchor through the lean years, customers becoming neighbors, neighbors becoming friends. I met my Sarah there when she brought in her father's old Chevrolet, engine knocking like a woodpecker in spring. She had these green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, which she did often once I started explaining what was wrong in terms that made sense. 6 months later, I was asking her father for her hand, promising I'd take care of her with the same dedication I brought to fixing engines. We built our life methodically, the way I approached restoration work, one careful step after another. Sarah taught elementary school while I gradually took over more responsibility at the shop. Our first child, Michael, arrived when I was 25, followed by twins Jennifer and David 2 years later. Sunday dinners became our family tradition, Sarah's pot roast filling the kitchen with warmth while I helped with homework at the dining room table, oil permanently embedded under my fingernails despite multiple scrubbings. The children grew up understanding that work wasn't just about earning money. It was about contributing something meaningful to your community, about being someone people could count on when things went wrong. Max came into our lives during what I now recognize was our golden period. The children were teenagers, the shop was thriving, and Sarah had just been promoted to principal. We'd always had dogs, but Max was different, a German Shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and an almost human ability to read situations. Sarah found him at the shelter, barely 8 weeks old, all ears and paws with a serious expression that made her laugh. From the beginning, he attached himself to me with unwavering loyalty, following me to the shop each morning, lying patient beside whatever car I was working on, alert to every sound and movement. He seemed to understand that our home ran on routines, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of problems solved through honest effort. The years passed with the comfortable rhythm of small-town life. I watched my children graduate, start careers, bring home spouses I grew to love like my own. Sarah and I became grandparents to 7 beautiful souls who'd visit summers, filling our house with laughter and sticky fingerprints. I'd retired from active shop work, but kept my hand in through weekend projects, teaching my grandsons the same lessons my grandfather had taught me. Max grayed around his muzzle but remained sharp, still following me to the garage, still alert to changes in routine or mood that others might miss. Everything changed when Sarah got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the doctors said, aggressive, advanced, limited options. The months that followed tested every foundation we'd built. I became caretaker, chauffeur, medical advocate, watching the woman who'd been my anchor fade despite every prayer and treatment we could afford. Max seemed to understand her suffering, spending his days lying beside her hospital bed, moving only when I moved. The night she passed, he whimpered once, then pressed close against my leg as I sat holding her hand, both of us understanding that our world had fundamentally shifted. The 5 years since Sarah's death had been about learning to live with profound absence. The children worried, visiting more frequently, suggesting I move closer to them, but this house held too much of her presence to abandon. I developed new routine. Ease morning coffee for one, evening walks with Max through neighborhoods, where we'd raised our family, weekend trips to the hardware store, just to have conversations with familiar faces. People were kind but careful, treating widowhood like a condition that required gentle handling. I'd smile and accept their concern while privately longing for something, anything, that might restore the sense of purpose that had defined my working years. That's why the county auction notice caught my attention. The Henderson place had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, since old Walter died and his children moved to the city, wanting nothing to do with rural property they considered worthless. The farm sat on 12 acres outside town, buildings slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. Most folks saw it as an eyesore, but I saw bones that might still be sound beneath the rust and rot. The main barn particularly intrigued me, a massive structure that predated World War II, built when craftsmanship meant something permanent. Max and I had driven past it countless times during our evening explorations, and he'd always shown unusual interest, nose pressed to the truck window, ears alert to something I couldn't perceive. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cold, October air-sharp with the promise of winter. I loaded Max into the passenger seat of my pickup, his favorite spot since Sarah's passing, and drove the familiar route past cornfields harvested down to stubble. Other bidders were already walking the property when we arrived, mostly dealers and scrap collectors, people who saw dollar signs in salvageable materials rather than restoration potential. I registered with the auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried across the crowd, then began my own survey of what was being offered. The house itself was beyond saving, foundation problems evident in sagging floors and separated walls, but the barn called to me like it had during our drives past. Standing in the doorway, breathing air thick with decades of hay, dust, and animal presence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since losing Sarah, possibility. The structure was sound, massive hand-hewn beams showing the kind of craftsmanship my grandfather would have appreciated. Max entered cautiously beside me, nose working overtime, occasionally pausing at specific spots along the walls with an intensity that seemed almost purposeful. When the auctioneer reached the barn in his catalog, I found myself bidding against Jimmy Kowalski, who owned the scrapyard outside town. Jimmy wanted it for the metal roofing and support brackets, planning to tear it down and sell the materials piecemeal. I wanted it for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, something about preserving what was worth saving, about having a project that required the skills Sarah had always admired. The bidding escalated beyond what most considered reasonable for a building that needed substantial work. People began shaking their heads, making comments about fool's errands and money wasted on dreams. When I finally won at $8,000, the reactions were immediate and predictable. Jimmy threw his hands up in disgust, muttering about city folks who didn't understand rural realities. Martha Hendricks, who taught with Sarah for 30 years, approached with poorly concealed concern, suggesting I might be making decisions too quickly, that grief sometimes clouded judgment. Even my son Michael called that evening, having heard about the purchase through the small-town network that monitored unusual behavior among its aging residents. His tone carried the careful patience reserved for parents who might be losing their grip on practical thinking. But Max seemed pleased with our acquisition. During our first official visit to examine what we'd bought, he explored the barn with systematic thoroughness, occasionally stopping to paw at loose boards or sniff particular sections of the floor with sustained interest. I dismissed his behavior as natural curiosity about residual animal sense, focusing instead on assessing the work required to make the structure weathertight. The roof needed partial replacement, several wall boards required attention, and the electrical system, what existed of it, needed complete updating. It would be a project worthy of the skills I'd developed over decades of restoration work. Winter passed in planning and preparation. I sketched layouts, researched materials, contacted suppliers who remembered me from my shop-owning days. The work gave me purpose that had been missing since retirement, something to discuss when neighbors asked how I was managing. Max and I made regular trips to the property, checking on security and weather damage, gradually accumulating tools and materials in preparation for spring construction. During these visits, I noticed Max's continued fascination with specific areas of the barn, particularly a section of the east wall where boards seemed older and more weathered than surrounding materials. Spring brought energy I hadn't felt in years. With materials staged and plans finalized, I began the systematic process of restoration. Max established himself as my constant companion and unofficial supervisor, lying in whatever shade was available while I worked, occasionally moving to investigate sounds or movements that escaped my attention. The work felt good, physical labor that produced visible progress, problems that yielded to patience and the right approach. Neighbors who'd been skeptical began stopping by to check our progress, some offering assistance, others simply curious about what the widower and his dog were attempting to accomplish. It was during the fourth week of work that Max's behavior shifted from curious to insistent. While replacing boards on the east wall, I noticed him repeatedly pawing at a specific section of flooring, whining softly when I didn't respond to his apparent urgency. The boards in that area seemed solid enough, but his persistence finally convinced me to investigate more thoroughly. Using a pry bar to lift several planks revealed something unexpected, a section of concrete floor that appeared newer than the surrounding foundation, roughly rectangular in shape, approximately 6 feet by 4 feet. The discovery triggered a cascade of questions I hadn't anticipated. Why would someone pour concrete in just one section of a dirt floor barn? The work appeared professional, level, and finished, but without explanation or obvious purpose. Max's excitement intensified as I exposed more of the anomalous area, his nose working constantly, occasionally looking up at me with an expression that seemed almost communicative. That night, lying in bed while rain drummed against my bedroom windows, I found myself wondering about Walter Henderson's final years, about why a man would modify a barn floor without apparent reason. Sleep became elusive as possibilities multiplied in my mind. Walter had been a private man, never married, living alone on the property for nearly 20 years after inheriting it from his parents. Neighbors remembered him as polite but distant, someone who kept to himself and seemed content with solitude. He'd worked various jobs around town: maintenance, part-time farming, occasional construction, nothing that would explain the need for specialized concrete work in an otherwise utilitarian barn. Max sensed my restlessness, moving from his usual spot by the foot of the bed to lie closer, his warm presence a comfort against the growing uncertainty about what we might have stumbled into. The following morning brought clarity about my next steps. I contacted Tom Wilson, who'd handled concrete work in the area for 40 years, showing him photographs of what we'd uncovered. His assessment was immediate and troubling. The concrete appeared to be covering something, installed as a barrier rather than a foundation improvement. The edges showed evidence of hasty work, corners not properly finished, surface texture suggesting it had been poured in sections rather than all at once. When I asked about permits or records, Tom shook his head. This kind of work should have required documentation, especially on property within county jurisdiction. Max's behavior provided additional evidence that something significant lay beneath that concrete pad. He'd begun refusing to leave the barn at the end of our workdays, positioning himself near the covered area with an alertness I'd learned to respect. During our evening walks around the property, he'd pull toward the barn rather than following our usual routes, occasionally stopping to look back at me with what seemed like frustration at my lack of understanding. His instincts had always been reliable, warning me about approaching strangers, alerting to problems I might otherwise miss. This felt different, more urgent, as if he sensed something requiring immediate attention. The decision to break through the concrete came after a week of sleepless nights and growing conviction that Max was trying to communicate something important. I rented a jackhammer from the equipment company in town, telling them I was removing a section of damaged foundation. The lie felt necessary. Small towns thrive on speculation, and I wasn't ready to involve others in whatever we might discover. Early Saturday morning, with Max positioned near the barn entrance as if standing guard, I began the careful process of breaking through Walter Henderson's secret. The first crack revealed airspace beneath the concrete, confirming Tom's assessment that it was covering something hollow. Working methodically, I removed chunks of broken concrete, exposing what appeared to be a wooden structure underneath, planks arranged like a cover or lid, obviously predating the concrete overlay. Max's excitement became almost frantic as I cleared more debris, his whining punctuated by occasional sharp barks that seemed intent to encourage my progress. When I finally cleared enough concrete to lift one of the wooden planks, the musty air that escaped carried scents that made Max nearly vibrate with anticipation. Beneath the wooden cover lay Walter Henderson's secret, a hand-dug chamber approximately 6 feet deep, lined with concrete blocks and accessed by a crude ladder. Battery-powered lanterns revealed what appeared to be a storage cache filled with items that defied easy explanation. Military equipment from various eras, boxes of documents wrapped in plastic, several firearms in protective cases, and containers whose contents remained mysterious in the lantern's limited illumination. The air smelled of preservatives and careful storage, suggesting this had been a long-term project rather than temporary concealment. Max refused to descend into the chamber, but his agitation made clear he wanted me to investigate thoroughly. Using the ladder Walter had installed, I began cataloging what appeared to be a lifetime collection of items that someone had considered too valuable or dangerous to leave exposed. The military equipment included uniforms, medals, and documentation from World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam, some bearing names I recognized from local families, others completely unfamiliar. The firearms ranged from antique rifles to more modern weapons, all carefully maintained and legally registered according to documentation found with each piece. But it was the boxes of documents that transformed curiosity into genuine concern. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and correspondence spanning decades, much of it bearing names of people I'd known personally, some still living in town. Walter had apparently maintained meticulous records of financial transactions, property transfers, and business dealings that painted a picture of systematic document collection spanning his entire adult life. Many items appeared to be copies rather than originals, suggesting surveillance rather than theft, observation rather than participation. Among the papers, I discovered correspondence between Walter and various law enforcement agencies, indicating he'd served as an unofficial informant for federal investigations spanning several decades. Letters from FBI agents, ATF officials, and county prosecutors revealed that my quiet neighbor had been documenting criminal activities, tax evasion, and other illegal operations throughout our rural community. The most recent correspondence dated just 6 months before his death, suggesting active participation in ongoing investigations until his final illness. The implications hit me like physical force. Walter Henderson hadn't been the reclusive farmer everyone assumed. He'd been a federal informant with access to information that could destroy reputations, end careers, and send prominent community members to prison. The concrete covering hadn't been about hiding treasure. It had been about protecting evidence that powerful people would kill to suppress. Max's persistent alertness suddenly made perfect sense. He'd been responding to the scent of danger that still lingered around Walter's carefully preserved secrets. My hands shook as I examined documentation that implicated people I'd considered pillars of the community. County commissioners involved in bid-rigging schemes, local bank officials facilitating money laundering operations, business leaders systematically evading taxes through elaborate shell companies. Names I recognized from church, from social gatherings, from decades of friendly interaction appeared throughout Walter's meticulous records as subjects of federal investigation. The scope of corruption he'd documented was breathtaking, involving millions of dollars and criminal networks that reached into state government. But the most shocking discovery came in a manila envelope marked with my own name. Inside, Walter had documented my father's involvement in a parts theft ring that had operated through our family auto shop during the 1980s. Detailed records showed systematic theft of expensive automotive components, falsified insurance claims, and coordination with salvage yards to dispose of stolen merchandise. My father, the man I'd idolized for his integrity and work ethic, had been stealing from customers and insurance companies for years, using our family business as a front for organized theft. The revelation shattered every assumption I'd held about my father's character and our family's reputation. Walter's evidence was comprehensive and damning: photographs of stolen parts, copies of falsified paperwork, recorded conversations that revealed my father's active participation in criminal conspiracy. According to the documentation, the operation had continued until my father's sudden death from a heart attack, with Walter's investigation ending only because the primary subject was deceased and prosecution was no longer viable. Max climbed partway down the ladder, resting against my legs as I struggled to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. My father's death, which I'd always attributed to the stress of running a small business, now appeared potentially connected to the pressure of ongoing federal investigation. Walter's notes indicated that arrests were imminent when my father died, suggesting he'd been living with the knowledge that his criminal activities were about to be exposed. The heart attack that killed him might have been triggered by stress from the investigation rather than legitimate business pressures. The ethical implications were staggering. Revealing Walter's cash would destroy families throughout our community, ending careers and sending elderly people to prison for crimes committed decades ago. But suppressing the evidence would make me complicit in covering up systematic corruption that had enriched criminals at the expense of honest citizens. Some of the crimes documented were recent enough to still be prosecutable, meaning Walter's death had temporarily suspended rather than ended several federal investigations. I spent the remainder of that day photographing every document, creating a complete digital record while trying to decide what moral obligation demanded. Max remained close throughout the process, occasionally nuzzling my hand when the emotional weight became overwhelming. His presence reminded me of the values Sarah had always admired: courage to do what's right regardless of personal cost, integrity that doesn't bend to convenience or comfort. She would have expected me to honor Walter's sacrifice rather than protect people who'd betrayed community trust. The decision crystallized during our drive home that evening. Passing houses of people whose names appeared in Walter's files, I realized that corruption had been hiding in plain sight for decades, protected by the assumption that small-town neighbors couldn't be criminals. Walter Henderson had died carrying secrets that could restore stolen money to victims, prevent future crimes, and ensure that justice reached people who'd considered themselves beyond accountability. My role wasn't to judge, but to ensure his evidence reached proper authorities. Monday morning, I contacted Special Agent Patricia Morrison, whose business card appeared multiple times in Walter's correspondence. Her response was immediate and intense. Walter's death had interrupted several ongoing investigations, and his informant records had been considered lost. The evidence I'd discovered represented years of irreplaceable documentation that could resurrect prosecutions federal agents had been forced to abandon. She arranged to meet at the barn that afternoon, bringing a team to properly secure and catalog Walter's cache. The FBI's arrival transformed our quiet rural property into a crime scene. Agent Morrison's team spent 3 days photographing, cataloging, and removing evidence while maintaining security that kept curious neighbors at a distance. Max adapted to their presence with surprising calm, seeming to understand that these people represented the culmination of Walter's life work. Agent Morrison explained that Walter had been one of their most valuable informants, risking his life to document crimes that traditional investigations couldn't penetrate. The scope of Walter's sacrifice became clear through Agent Morrison's briefings. He'd lived in constant danger for nearly 30 years, gathering evidence against people who would have killed him without hesitation if his activities had been discovered. His isolation hadn't been preference, it had been protection, necessary distance from a community where any friendship might expose his true purpose. The concrete covering and hidden chamber represented sophisticated operational security designed to protect evidence even if his cover was blown. Within 2 weeks of the FBI's evidence recovery, arrests began throughout the county. Local news covered each development with growing amazement, as respected community leaders were charged with crimes ranging from tax evasion to racketeering. The scope of corruption Walter had documented was even broader than his files suggested, with each arrest leading to additional evidence and more charges. People I'd known for decades were revealed as sophisticated criminals whose activities had cost taxpayers millions of dollars. My father's posthumous exposure as a criminal proved surprisingly liberating rather than devastating. Learning the truth about his character explained inconsistencies I'd noticed but dismissed during my youth, unexplained prosperity during lean economic periods, customer complaints that never quite made sense, his nervous behavior during visits from insurance investigators. Walter's evidence confirmed that my success in maintaining the shop's reputation after inheriting it hadn't been built on my father's foundation, but despite his corruption. The community's reaction was predictably mixed. Families whose loved ones were arrested blamed me for destroying reputations and ending careers. Others expressed gratitude for exposing corruption that had affected them personally, overcharged insurance claims, rigged municipal contracts, tax burdens increased to compensate for revenue lost to criminal schemes. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about Walter's undercover work, painting him as a hero who'd sacrificed personal happiness to protect community interests. Max and I became minor celebrities, featured in regional news stories about the discovery that revolutionized understanding of rural crime networks. The attention was uncomfortable, but worthwhile if it encouraged other people to trust their instincts about suspicious activities in their own communities. Max seemed to enjoy the recognition, posing patiently for photographers while maintaining his dignified bearing. His role in guiding us to Walter's cache earned him treats and attention from visitors who understood that sometimes dogs perceive truths that humans miss. The legal resolution took nearly 2 years, with trials, plea bargains, and appeals generating ongoing media coverage. Restitution payments returned millions of dollars to victims, while asset forfeitures recovered property purchased with stolen funds. Several defendants received substantial prison sentences, while others negotiated cooperation agreements that exposed additional criminal networks throughout the region. The FBI credited Walter's evidence with supporting convictions that wouldn't have been possible through traditional investigation methods. Agent Morrison visited regularly during the legal proceedings, sharing updates about cases that traced back to Walter's documentation. She explained how informants like Walter represented the hidden heroes of law enforcement, ordinary citizens who risked everything to expose crimes that threatened community welfare. His work had prevented millions in additional losses and protected countless future victims from financial predators who'd considered rural communities safe hunting grounds. The barn itself became a symbol of hidden truth, revealing itself through patience and attention to detail. I completed the restoration as originally planned, but now it serves dual purpose, functional space for woodworking and automotive projects, plus monument to Walter Henderson's courage and sacrifice. A small plaque near the entrance honors his memory without revealing details that might compromise ongoing investigations. Max seems to approve of the tribute, often lying near it during our work sessions, as if standing guard over Walter's legacy. Our discovery fundamentally changed how I view community relationships and trust. People I'd considered friends and neighbors had been systematically stealing from the very community that supported their prosperity. Walter's isolation, which I'd attributed to antisocial tendencies, had actually been noble sacrifice to protect the investigation that would eventually expose their crimes. His willingness to live as a suspected recluse, rather than risk compromising his mission, showed character that deserved recognition, rather than the suspicion he'd endured during his lifetime. The financial impact proved substantial and unexpected. The FBI's Victim Compensation Program provided payments to people affected by documented crimes, including insurance fraud that had artificially inflated premiums throughout the region. My family received compensation for thefts from our shop during my father's criminal period, money that helped fund improvements to the barn and property. More importantly, clearing the air about my father's activities allowed me to rebuild relationships with customers who'd harbored suspicions about our family's business practices. Max's behavior returned to normal once the FBI completed their evidence recovery, but he maintained special interest in the barn that suggested ongoing awareness of its significance. During quiet moments in the restored space, I sometimes catch him looking toward the corner where Walter's cash was hidden, as if remembering the excitement of discovery and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. His instincts had been perfect throughout the process, guiding us toward truth that needed revealing regardless of personal cost. The experience taught me that grief and loss can obscure purpose until unexpected discoveries restore sense of meaning and direction. Sarah's death had left me feeling disconnected from community engagement, but Walter's hidden legacy pulled me back into active participation in ensuring justice and accountability. The work we'd done together, Max and I, with Walter's posthumous guidance, proved that ordinary citizens can make extraordinary differences when they pay attention to details others might ignore. Looking back now, I understand that buying the Henderson barn wasn't really about having a restoration project or proving that abandoned buildings could find new purpose. It was about honoring the values Sarah and I had shared: integrity, courage, commitment to community welfare over personal comfort. Walter Henderson had lived those values in secret for 30 years, sacrificing personal happiness to protect people who'd never know his name or understand his sacrifice. Max and I had simply been fortunate enough to discover his legacy and ensure it reached the people who could honor it properly. The ridicule we'd endured for buying what others considered worthless property now feels like validation rather than criticism. Sometimes the things that appear most abandoned or hopeless contain the greatest potential for redemption and justice. Walter's cash represented not just evidence of crimes, but proof that one person's dedication to truth can outlast their lifetime and continue protecting community interests long after their death. Max's persistence in guiding me toward that discovery showed that loyalty and intuition can reveal truths that logic and conventional thinking might miss. Today, the barn serves its intended purpose as workshop and storage space, but its real value lies in the reminder it provides about hidden heroism and the importance of paying attention to details that others might dismiss. Max still accompanies me there daily, now 8 years old but still alert to sounds and movements that might require investigation. We've developed new routines around maintaining Walter's memorial and hosting occasional visits from law enforcement officials who want to understand how one man's courage created such lasting impact. The experience fundamentally changed my relationship with community involvement and civic responsibility. Serving as Walter's unofficial representative during the legal proceedings connected me with regional organizations working to prevent rural crime and support victims of financial fraud. The skills I'd developed through decades of mechanical restoration proved surprisingly applicable to helping other victims navigate complex legal and financial recovery processes. Max and I now volunteer with programs that educate rural communities about recognizing and reporting suspicious activities. Perhaps most importantly, the discovery restored my sense that individual actions can create meaningful change even when circumstances seem hopeless or overwhelming. Walter Henderson proved that ordinary citizens can serve extraordinary purposes when they commit themselves to protecting community welfare over personal comfort. Max demonstrated that loyalty and attention to subtle details can guide us toward opportunities for service that we might otherwise miss. Together, they taught me that purpose and meaning often hide beneath surfaces that others consider worthless or abandoned. The restoration of dignity that followed our discovery wasn't about public recognition or financial compensation. It was about understanding that integrity and courage can outlast their original practitioners and continue creating positive impact through people willing to honor their legacy. Sarah would have been proud of our role in bringing Walter's truth to light, knowing that justice delayed isn't always justice denied if the right people discover evidence that can still make a difference. Max's steady presence throughout the process reminded me that the most important partnerships are built on mutual trust and shared commitment to doing what's right regardless of personal cost. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your understanding of the people and community around you? I'd love to hear about moments when paying attention to details others missed led you toward truths that needed revealing, or times when your instincts guided you toward discoveries that created lasting positive change.